This is the GFX100 II. This is Fujifilm's new version of the GFX100, and as you might notice, it looks quite a bit different than the original GFX100, but we'll get into that here in just a little bit. This is going to be a little bit of a different format for this video, as I am not allowed to share any of my opinions or what I think about any of the features on that. We're gonna have to save that for a future video. And I do need to note that this is not a final version of this camera. It's running pre-production firmware and it is a pre-production camera. So keep that in mind as you check out these images popping up on the screen here in just a little bit. Personally, for me, my biggest question is if this is a replacement for the GFX100, where does that leave the GFX100S? Only time will tell, I guess. As you can see, one of the biggest differences that you can really notice is that the GFX100 version 2 doesn't actually have a built-in battery grip like its predecessor. Now, there are connections on the bottom of the camera, so we can expect there to be an additional grip as an added accessory. Also, behind the screen here, we can see that it does actually have support for the external cooling fan. Just like the rest of the Fujifilm cameras, it's still going to take the MPW235 battery. And that's kind of nice to see that they haven't come out with a new battery and they're able still to leverage this existing battery. There is also a brand new film simulation in this camera, and it's the Rela Ace. Actually, I might get in trouble for saying this, but I actually really like this film simulation. It's probably going to be one of my favorites. One of the huge updates for this camera is that it has native support for the Frame.io network. And you're not going to need any additional accessories for that. Everything's built into the camera. Frame.io is basically a camera to cloud system. So since the camera doesn't actually have a built-in grip, the exterior of this camera versus its predecessor has changed significantly. It's similar to the GFX100S, but it actually has a ton more buttons. There's an always on display up on the top of the camera that has a ton of information on there, whether you're doing photo or video. For ports, this camera is going to have a USB-C port, an Ethernet port, a full-size HDMI, a separate mic, and a headphone jack. As far as cards go, this camera does take both CF Express Type B and UHS-2 SD cards. Just like the rest of the other Fujifilm cameras, they have the super flexible screen on the back. The camera has an updated EVF, and it's sporting a 9.44 million dot EVF with 120 frames per second live view with 5 frames per second of blackout-free monitoring. That's a huge upgrade versus the predecessor. The GFX100 II also has a brand new 102 megapixel sensor, and it is paired up with the X Processor 5. It's going to have 30% more dynamic range versus the GFX100 and the GFX100S. They've improved the raw quality of the photos up to 16-bit versus the 14-bit of the predecessor. One notable change is the ISO now starts at 80 versus 100 of the GFX100. Thanks to its redesigned shutter mechanism, the camera is now capable of shooting up to 8 frames per second. There's been a huge update to the video side of this camera as well versus its previous generations, including the GFX100 and the GFX100S. It can now do 4K 60 with no crop, and it can also do 8K 30 with a 1.44x crop. It also supports built-in support for 422 10-bit Apple ProRes built into the camera. It supports the new F-Log2 profile that provides up to 14 stops of dynamic range. Has multiple cinema formats also. It's got VistaVision, 35mm FF, and 35mm FF anamorphic. One big change also is that now it has a built-in waveform and vector scope built into the back of the screen, so you won't need an external monitor to actually check those. The IBIS system has been redesigned as well. It now supports up to 8 stops of image stabilization. You can now record directly to an SSD, so you don't actually have to record to the internal memory if you don't want to. They did also improve the autofocus on this camera with the AI autofocus algorithm that does provide some updates to better subject tracking in both video and photo. There is also a new lens, which is the 55 1.7, and I use that to take all the photos for everything that you've seen today. As far as the lens go, it does actually have 11 aperture blades, so you can kind of expect to see some nice bokeh coming from this. The lens does have the WR designation, which means it is going to be okay in a rain, shine, a dust storm, basically anywhere outside that you might expect some weather with your camera. It is actually pretty light as well, at only 780 grams. The 35mm equivalent of the lens is 44mm, and they're touting that that's going to be very similar to see what your eyes can see as far as a natural field of view goes. Well, this has been a quick look at the GFX100 II. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. We'll do our best to answer any that we can. If you want to see a full review on this video, make sure you hit subscribe and hit that like button so we know that you want to see a full review. Well, this is Adam, and I'll see you next time.